So I want to talk about a possibility that hopefully is obvious, but I doubt it is. Cities can be cut off. Have you thought about this before? Have you ever looked at where you live on a map and zoomed out a little bit and looked at the entrances and exits from said city? How do you get in and out? This is much more important in some parts of the country than others. But even in so I'm thinking of places like Utah, where almost all the population in Utah is clustered in a tight area in the northern part of the state. And it was originally settled precisely because there were very few entrances and exits, and it would have been easy to protect from armies that would come in or people that would come in and harass you, if nothing worse. But it's equally as true in sprawling suburbs like anywhere in the mid-Atlantic in the United States, where it's just built up everywhere. And the reason is because there aren't enough farms around there to sustain that. So cities can be cut off. Let me look at an example here. This is from the recent hurricane. Here's a post from X where this person said all roads in and out of Asheville, North Carolina are still closed. It sounds like Asheville is still only accessible by air unless you head up from I-26, and even then you will encounter closures before the city. This is an absolute mega disaster for Western North Carolina on the order of Hurricane Katrina. Now, I can't assess the validity of what this person is saying, but they're showing this screenshot of what looks like the highways into Asheville being impassable. Okay? Here's a post about Mount Holly, North Carolina. And what you see is tons of houses in this depression here. It spans quite a bit. So you have this road that's completely knocked out. And all these houses are, this was a video I took a screenshot of. These houses were actually floating down the water. Okay? You can see how wide that river is. So what happens, let's say that you live in Asheville, what happens when these roads are knocked out? And 2 weeks ago, you may have looked at this and said, well, what event could possibly cut off these four or so main roads in and out of this big city, right? Well, here are some things to think about. There really aren't any self-sufficient areas anymore. If something were to happen to the roads in and out of your area, what would you do long term to continue your life? I'm not sure normal people realize just how much flows by way of rail and tractor trailers in this country. Basically, those things carry life as you know it in them. And if something were to happen to discontinue their free passage, and it's an enormous volume of stuff, you would not have any food, you would not have any medicine, you would not have any cool furniture from IKEA, you wouldn't have anything that you have, because it's extremely unlikely that any significant percent of the goods that you have come from your immediate geographical location. Now, I mentioned roads, I mentioned railways. Airports are another thing to think about. This post I mentioned, it said that according to this person, the only way in and out of Asheville right now is by air. Well, things can disrupt airways too. Okay, whether those be storms or earthquakes jacking up the runways, or violence. If people are shooting at planes and helicopters, they're not going to come in. But even without any disruption to the actual airport, and there's power issues, there are other things. But let's just say somehow the airport's 100% fine. You're still excruciatingly limited in what you can take out and bring in if you can only do it by air. Again, you have to look at the vast quantity of goods that are transported on trains. Some of these trains are 2 miles long, filled with stuff. How much can you fit in a helicopter? How much can you fit in a plane? It's nothing in comparison. Okay? To give you an idea of this, most of the things that are used in war zones by the military are airlifted. Even then, even with the vast resources of the military, which is designed around airlifting things, they use rail to transport vehicles and such as much as possible. If they can move it by rail, they do. If you've ever seen one of these trains loaded with military equipment, you know what I'm talking about. Imagine how many C-130s you would need to ship that same amount of gear. It's crazy. So what are some of the potential blockages? Well, water, we're seeing an example of that with the flooding from that hurricane. But it can also be frozen. So you can have ice and snow that block the way. Without modern snow removal, I can tell you that great swaths of the Rockies would be impassable for 6 months. Think about that. So where I live, for example, the main highway in and out of where I live, it would be completely impassable for at least 6 months. It would have feet of snow on it that whole time. What about earthquakes? If you've ever been on a road trip and you take note of how many bridges or narrow passes you go through, by narrow passes, you know those cuts through the mountain, whether they were made by river or man, and it's just this narrow little shelf next to the river or in between the two cliffs of the mountain. What do you think happens to all that if there's an earthquake? What do you think would happen, say, in Point of the Mountain, Utah, if there were a big earthquake? What would happen to the highway? And what would that do to the ability to traverse through there? What about people? Now, I warned you years ago that shipping services were going to feel increased pressure because of armed robberies. And if you've been paying attention, guess what you've seen recently? You've seen news reports of male men, male women. Yeah, there are a lot of those today. Mail carriers being attacked by armed robbers. And it's happened with commercial shipments as well. And I told you, and this has happened as well, that trains would get held up. Trains of packages have been held up by gunpoint, and people have taken all the packages. That's happened. I told you it would happen, and it happened. It seemed crazy, but guess what? It happened. And it is happening. It's going to happen more and more. There are videos circulating of gangs of illegal immigrants operating, I believe in Colorado. I don't remember the location, but you'll see it all over the place. I told you that was going to happen. I told you violence from immigration was going to happen. You import the third world, you get the third world. And as these gangs go uncontrolled, people are going to have to change their behavior, and the cost of everything is going to increase, and the availability of everything is going to decrease. But gangs aren't the only kinds of people that can interrupt the free flow of traffic through roads and rail and air. Military can as well. So obviously, if you've got a military occupation or an invasion, then these things will not be able to happen. But this can also happen through friendly military activity, if you could call it that. What do I mean? Roadblocks. What would cause that to happen? There are a lot of things that could cause that to happen. If you've got one main highway in and out of where you live, you should probably bank on something happening at some point that could cause those places to not be accessible. One of those things that could cause a military blockade or roadblocks is disease. If they enforce a quarantine, they could lock down a whole city. Frankly, I'm shocked that you didn't see too much of that during COVID. Nothing major enough to register. I'm shocked that that was the case. But you'll see it in the future, trust me. So, now I want to flip this around and end with the inverse of all of this. We're talking about why it might be a bad thing for these entryways to be cut off. Well, it's only a bad thing for the people whose houses are floating down the river or who are unprepared for something like this. What do I mean? Well, it's probably hard to imagine what I'm saying, that it could be a beneficial thing, in anything short of a long-term catastrophe. But let's start thinking about a long-term catastrophe for a moment. If you had, say, an epidemic, a real bad disease that's spreading everywhere, can you see why it might be a good thing if random people can't come into your city or town or wherever you are? I gave you the example of having many feet of snow on the ground for 6 months. Can you imagine a situation where that wouldn't be a bad thing? What if the grid is down? If the grid goes down, you want to be in a place that has as few people as possible for as long as you can. Why? Because the bad people, which you'll be shocked just how many people revert to that in those kinds of situations, the bad people will be disproportionately taken out as they try to rape and pillage. But everyone is going to have a really hard time surviving. And the longer you can go in that situation, the better it's going to be, because there will be far fewer people left to harass you. And so sometimes it can be a good thing to be in a place that, say, only has 2 points of entry and both of them rely on a really flimsy bridge, and you live in an earthquake zone. So these are things to think about. But for the short term, from a point of preparation, you should ask yourself, how many points of entry and egress does your area have? And what would you do if all of a sudden they were closed to you and closed to everyone who would bring goods in? How would you fare if you didn't have access to food, external food, for, say, 3 months? What would you do? Would you be okay? These are things to think about.